go. Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, so I actually had a very, this is very exciting for me because, when you get to apply some of your learning into practice, it's always very fun. So on Shabbos morning, I woke up, and so I am a little bit of a coffee snob. I don't like, not that much of a coffee snob, but I use Keurigs, which is not that coffee snobbish, but it's better than the instant coffee. And so before Shabbos, I always brew myself like a double coffee of like a particular brand that I like, that's only like, because I'm a snob. Anyway, I wake up in the morning, on Shabbos morning, and I need my double coffee very, very, very badly for me to function, certainly on a Shabbos morning. And lo and behold, due to some quirk of the freezer and probably where I placed it, for whatever reason, the coffee was ice, complete block of ice, okay? I'm sure someone here knows the science of how fridges work, but I think you put it in the wrong place with the sensors, and it actually triggers everything to start going in overdrive, and it freezes half my fruit and vegetables are frozen as well. Anyway, bottom line is, Shabbos morning, and I have like an hour or so to give, an hour and a half to get to shul, and I have a block ice of coffee. So what do you do? So first, right, so what do you do? Based on what we learned, trivia. Drink water. I wish, Jenny, I wish. A popsicle. That would take a very long time. It was really frozen. Any thoughts? Can you put it next to the thing? So if you recall, so probably this didn't, honestly, I'll be very honest, it didn't, we learned through this a few weeks ago, right? But it's like, how often are you like defrosting a block of ice? Like, who's doing this on Shabbos? So like it went out of my mouth, and I didn't have it like at the tip of my fingertips. So I had to review. And if you recall, you're actually not supposed to place it next to a heating element of any sort, not even on the blech, but you're not even supposed to place it right. One of the things we spoke about was this notion of changing the structure, something a physical structure into something which is a liquid. To do so actively is actually problematic, right? To go ahead and crush ice is for sure usser. Right? To go ahead and crush ice was explicit, but even placing it near a heating element, not even on the heating element, but near a heating element, according to many poskim, is usher as well. So I would not be allowed to place it there. I would not be allowed to crush it. If I were to crush it, I could not drink it. If I placed it near the heating elements, it's less, and therefore I shouldn't have done it, but I'd be able to drink it after the fact. Yes, Sarah?
Go ahead. No, finish your story.
Okay, good story. Okay, so what are you allowed to do? So the poskim do say that what you are allowed to do is if it's already submerged in liquid, or you submerge it in liquid, then the transformation between solid and liquid is not as evident. The same way I'm allowed to place ice into any liquid. I could even place ice into a hot liquid. That's fine, because then the melting of it takes place in a fashion which is not as evident, and therefore the poskim are more makel. Even then, you probably shouldn't. Then there's a machlokas. Most poskim say you're allowed to crush it at that point. Some say you shouldn't. So unless it's shas hadchak, like it's a time of great need, if it's submerged in a liquid, if it's time of great need, you would be allowed to crush it with like a knife or a fork at that point in another liquid. Okay, so you could debate if it's a time of great need. I will paskin. Trust me, it was a time of great need. So the truth is, I couldn't even get hot water. Our urn also happened to break. So I was like, okay, I'll drink a regular coffee. But the urn wasn't working, whatever. So, first world problems, right, as they say, right? This is like, okay, big deal. Anyway, the bottom line is, so what I was able to do was pour some liquid on it, I poured some milk on top of it, and then I went ahead and I crushed it and had myself a slushy coffee that morning. But it was really halacha l'maisa of some of what we learned, which was fun and exciting. And yes, Cyril, thank you for waiting so patiently. What's your question or comment?
So since you brought that up,
yeah.
My coffee maker is, I can make a pot of coffee, and it beeps when it's finished. There's capacity to turn off the beep, and but you can still program it to heat, to warm up. Could you make a pot of coffee beforehand, leave it on the burner, not touch it, let the timer go on, let's say at 6 in the morning, which would end up heating whatever is in the pot. There's no beep. Could you do that?
Great question. So I'm actually gonna hold off on that question. We're not gonna answer it because a lot of what we're discussing actually relates directly to that question of using a heating element where there is raw food. It's a great question. So if I don't come back the next 2 weeks, come back to me. But I want to get there because it's going to be based on a couple of principles.
So please forgive me because I don't remember. Could you put that block of ice in the sun? If there's a sunny spot on your table, could you just...
So there are some poskim. It happened to be, if you recall, Shabbos morning at like 7. Wasn't that hot outside. But the poskim do... relative to Baltimore. It would have taken a while. I needed that coffee then, right then. Trust me. What's it called? But it would have taken a little while. But the poskim, I believe, and I did not I'm not 100% sure, but I believe the poskim did distinguish between placing it near a heating element, which is aser, as opposed to placing it outside, which would have been more like inadvertent, where there would have been more poskim allowing it to happen. But I'm not 100% sure. I'm not 100% sure. Yes.
So you're talking ice to liquid.
Yeah.
What about solid to defrosted? Can you put it?
Yeah, then it's solid to solids. That's fine. Meaning like chicken, which is frozen. So for example, I had like these like vegetables after, which were frozen, and so going ahead and defrosting them, then there's no real.
I keep extra hummus in the freezer.
Yeah, that's solid to solid. That's fine. 100% fine. 100% fine. Yeah. Okay. Now let's go back to our more recent discussion. We're on page 130, and so a couple of you. So let's just do a quick review because we missed last week. I don't plan on being away for another couple of weeks, so we'll have a little bit of consistency again, God willing. And that is the last thing we spoke about is shehiyah. Shehiyah means that one is not allowed to place food on the fire, food on an element, unless it's cooked. What's the concern? The concern is if I have, going into Shabbos, I have chicken soup on my stovetop, there's a concern if it's not fully ready at that point, I may go ahead and start changing the knobs, right? People, oh my gosh, it's still raw a little bit, so what am I going to do? I'm going to crank it up to make it go much faster, and therefore, come and then cook on Shabbos, right? So anytime I have food which is not fully cooked on Shabbos, there's a concern of leaving it on a fire. Same with putting chicken in my oven. I'm concerned I'm going to start adjusting the temperature because my food is not yet fully cooked, and that is called the Isra of Shehiyah. We spoke about when it's cooked a certain amount, which we're going to get back to, then it's allowed, right? And that we call Kimachal Ben Drusai. We're going to come back to that today. We also spoke about when the ashes are covered, which we're also going to start talking about today, and what that looks like in a modern oven, because until now we've been talking about an ancient oven, and the ancient oven is basically like a round, a box of some sort with coals and a person covering those coals. That's what we're talking about. The question is, how do we apply that to the modern day ovens? We'll get back to that, okay? The first thing we're going to discuss, though, is one thing that some of you mentioned, this notion of a raw piece of meat. So the Gemara is let's read the Gemara. We'll see what's going on up here. Again, there's a general concern. I can't place my chicken or my chicken soup or a stew on a fire before Shabbos unless it's fully cooked, because the concern, I'm going to go ahead and stoke the coals. Modern terminology, I'm going to adjust the heat, adjust the temperature of the oven, which would obviously be a prohibition on Shabbos. Okay. However, the Gemara tells us like this. If you look on page 130, source 14, there's a quote from the Gemara in Shabbos. V'hashta de Amar Mar. Gezerah Shema Yechata Begechalim. Now that you explain to me that the Gemara is saying like this. The Gemara says that now that you, the master, meaning the teacher, explains that the whole issue of placing uncooked items on a fire is a concern that you might stoke the coals. That's the whole concern. Haikadera Chaita Shari Lanucha Erev Shabbos Michashecha Betanura My Taima. So why is it that we also are taught that I'm allowed to place a pot of raw meat on the fire before Shabbos? What's the reason for that? In other words, he says, I don't understand. You just told me that I'm not allowed to have raw food on a fire because there's a concern I'm going to adjust the meat. But why are we also taught that I'm allowed to place a stew of raw meat on a fire before Shabbos begins? So the Gemara answers, Kivan de lo chazi le'orta, since raw meat will not possibly be ready in the evening, Asuche masach daite mine, a person will not be thinking about it. V'lo asi lachtuye gechalim, and therefore a person will not go ahead and stoke the coals. And the Gemara says further, v'shada begar machaya shaper dami, and it doesn't have to be an entire pot of raw meat. Even throwing one raw bone, one raw piece, is enough to make it like a pot of raw meat. So what's the Gemara telling us over here? The Gemara is telling us like this. Normally there is a concern that I'm going to stoke the coals. But if the only concern is that I'm going to be in a rush. So it's Friday night, I have a meal that I started preparing, and it's not ready. I put it on the fire, I put my chicken on the fire, and then my meal's going to start soon, and I'm like, oh no, it's not ready. So I might, in the ancient world, stoke the coals, in the modern world, adjust the temperature, but if the Gemara is telling us if I place something which is completely raw right before Shabbos, and we'll see right before Shabbos what that means, we'll come back to the definition of right before Shabbos. If it's raw meat, the Gemara is telling us you could stoke all you want, it's going to take a while till it'll be ready. And therefore a person's not going to go ahead and stoke those coals, and therefore if a person places raw meat on their pot right before Shabbos, we're not concerned anymore that a person's going to stoke the coals, and therefore the whole concern of making sure you have to cover the coals or shovel out the ash, cover the coals with ashes or shovel out the coals, none of that is relevant because we're not going to think about it since there's this piece of raw meat. Now, I imagine in your head already, you're like, what are you talking about? I put raw meat in my oven all the time, and I crank it up, and I'm able to get it fully cooked in like 20 minutes, a half hour, I don't know, whatever, So there's going to be a major question, is this relevant? Is this whole halacha relevant in the 21st century, in our modern ovens? Okay, right? Meaning, if you're dealing with making food over a fire, right, there's only so much heat you could bring out of that fire. You could stoke all you want, it'll bring in more heat, but it's not going to, you're only going to get it so high, right? Does this whole principle apply in the modern era is a major question, which we'll see the poskim deal with. Yes?
So it's just interesting, it's saying it's not fit for consumption during the night, so that's kind of seems like the thing that's making it permissible. But what about in the morning? It's still Shabbos, and so then wouldn't somebody come to stoke their fire?
They may come to stoke the coals, but the Gemara, excellent observation. The Gemara is telling us that, this is a safeguard. So really, meaning one could have argued, what do you mean? A person knows it's Shabbos. Who's going to stoke the coals? But the Gemara recognizes that when we get a little worked up, we're a little anxious, then we may go ahead and absentmindedly, not deliberately, but we're anxious, and I might go ahead and do, oh no, what did I do? So there's more of a concern when there's less of a time frame. I'm more anxious, right? If I have to catch a flight, I'm more anxious. The more time frame I have, the less anxious I have. So it's like create the formula for me. But the point is that it's a formula. It's like in the daytime, there's less anxiety because there's more time. If it was just the daytime, we wouldn't have made this whole decree. It's because of the nighttime we made this decree, and anything therefore that is only going to be ready by the daytime, we're not going to think about at night. It's not going to be part of this decree. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
You said, can you actually say, okay, well, this principle is no longer applicable in the 21st century? Are there cases that...
L'chumra, for stringency, all the time. Yeah. In other words, we'll say this is all based on, meaning if you see explicitly what the reason is behind this, and you say well, this has no relationship to our modern day things, then absolutely. Yeah. For leniency, it gets a little more problematic. If we're to add a stringency is easy, right? The Gemara always says, to be lenient, you need to have broad shoulders. To be stringent, anyone can be strict. I'm saying that doesn't take a genius, yeah. Okay, fine. So it says Rashi. Rashi just unpacks, says basically what I said. Source 15, or I just more or less paraphrasing Rashi. So Rashi in source 15 on page 130. Haikadera chaisa shaper dami lashosa lechatchila mi ba'od yom betanor. If there is a pot of raw meat, I'm allowed to lechatchila, ideally, leave food on that fire while it's still day. V'misbashelas kol halayla, and it's going to cook the whole night. Devadai chayta lav adaita lemechla leorta. Since it's obvious, it's certain that when it comes to raw food, a person's not going to eat it that night. Ancha asam, therefore they're going to leave it there. Umishum lemachar, and because of tomorrow, lo asdeh chetuye, they're not going to go ahead and stoke the coals. Sharayesh la shahus gadol, there's sufficient time for it to cook without stoking. And even though, of course, there still is some level of concern, at that point, again, there's less concern. We're not going to be worried if it's just about the next day. Okay, so how do we rule? Says the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch rules this way. Look at source 16. We're just going to read the bold words. Says, Shahaya Chai. Actually, we're going to start in the beginning. If a person heated a oven with either the sediments, which waste of olives, which was the typical fuel they used, or wood, you're not allowed to leave food on the fire going into Shabbos. Excuse me. Elam kain, unless shayachai, unless the food was raw, shalon is bashal cloud, that it was not cooked at all. Dekivan shuchai, since it's raw, mesiach daitu mena adlamach, a person's not going to think about it until the next day. So the Shulchan Aruch rules this way practically and says, if you throw a raw piece of food into your oven, there's no concern because you're not going to be stoking the coals, and therefore you wouldn't have to cover the elements, you wouldn't have to tape the knobs, you wouldn't have to cover your everything because it's fully raw. There'd be no issues. Okay? Let's see some of the modern poskim. If you look at source 17, V'yesh leida. Okay, there's the Orcha Shabbos. It's a modern sefer. Okay, he says like this. He says V'yesh leida. Dekivan shetchilas habishol hi misha shegia tafshel lechom shayad soledas bo. He says, when do we consider the beginning of the cooking? Beginning of cooking. Again, it says it's fully raw. So fully raw means fully raw. When does it go from being fully raw to not fully raw? Like at what stage is it not fully raw? So he says, what do we call cooking? Any cooking is by definition when something is yad soledas bo. If you touch it, your hand will recoil. It's very hot. So therefore, l'chein in heter zeh shel kederach chayta nemar, this whole leniency of raw meat only applies be'ofen she'atav shel yagil l'shur shel yad tzeledesbo rak b'samach l'shkias achama. It has to be that it's only going to get to really hot yad tzeledesbo like right after sunset. V'lo kodem l'chein, and not before that. She'im yagil lechom sheyad tzeledesbo b'sham mukudemes yoser, because if it gets to the point of yad tzeledesbo, the meat becomes hot enough that it's very hot already at sunset, meaning when Shabbos starts. Azai b'yagia shah shkia kvar hischil habishol. Then when shkia arrives, it already started cooking. Ve'ein zu k'derech chaya. It's not raw. So he says the definition of raw is that it hasn't yet gotten so hot. So I don't know, maybe some of you can answer this question. If I throw, obviously it's going to depend on the piece of food, but it has to be raw and before, right? Take it out of my fridge, take it out of my freezer, whatever it is, and it has to be cold enough that it's not yet boiling hot. Once the meat itself becomes boiling hot, then it's called yad. Then it's yad soledesbo. And that's already the beginning of the bishul process. It's no longer halachically seen as raw. So when we say raw, it has to be really thrown into it has to be added to your pot, really close to Shabbos. Because if it's anywhere before, because after a little while, it's going to get so hot. Like if you were to take that piece of meat out theoretically and take it out, you'd say, oh, it's already really hot. Then it'd be too late. It has to be.
Even Shabbos morning, if you take the meat on the cholent, it's not yad soledesbo.
It'll be, no, it wouldn't be yad soledesbo.
But it's not that.
I'm not touching that piece of meat. Right? Really? If you take it right out of the thing, you would go into the cholent and take it out with your hands?
I wouldn't touch it.
Well, that's yad soledesbo. Yeah, the definition of yad soledesbo is like
in terms of the heat, I think I wouldn't touch it because it's like food. But no.
From a heat perspective? As a man without cooking hands, yeah, I don't.
It is. Yeah.
Okay.
Bone doesn't retain a lot of heat.
Not the bone. Again, retaining. Again, we're talking. You're right. Look, as soon as you take it out, within a second or two, I agree. If you put it on your plate, it's gonna lose its. But the point is that you touch it while it's there. If it somehow, again, is like a little bit scientific. You'd have to figure out how to take it out in a way that immediately you touch it, because you're gonna put your finger in the cholent. You're gonna be touching the gravy.
I'll put an extra piece.
Yeah, whatever. It's a little hard to define, but the point is, the major point that he's making is it has to be very quick, because once it gets to the point of hot, that's when the cooking process starts. Yes.
So the first source, when Gemara, we're talking about meat, and if I'm reading it correctly, then after that, it just keeps talking about food. So are we now assuming it applies to all food?
Good. So you're right. He's quoting over here a broader statement. The poskim do distinguish. They say something like meat, something which takes a significant amount of time to boil. Meaning, if you have some food that cooks very quickly, they would not be included. But if you have, and I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. Maybe someone here can. But if you have something which takes a significant time, like meat, which goes through a significant process, then they would be similar. And that's why he's using Orcha Shabbos as discussing a broader discussion, because he says you have these other pieces of food which also would take a very long time to cook. Yeah.
But here's the problem then, because we defined starting Shabbos. Let's say early Shabbos, but even our 18 or even our Shia is different than what other definitions are.
Excellent. Okay, so excellent question being brought up, and that is, what is the beginning of Shabbos? He said sunsets, right? So let's just think about this on two levels, both philosophically or technically, as well as practically. In other words, let's say you want to put the raw piece of meat into your cholent pot, let's say, okay, and you want to make sure there's enough time that it's close enough to Shabbos. Now you put it in the thing, and then you want to go light your candles. But you're accepting, let's say it's the summer, so you accepted Shabbos at 7:30, right? When's sunset? I don't know, 8:30, right? Something like that, right? So when does it have to be? When does it have to be raw, right? I lit the candles now. So for me it's Shabbos, but it's not Shabbos for everyone else. So what point of Shabbos are we talking about? Okay, I'm going to make it more. Okay, that's one major question discussed amongst the poskim. Some say, yeah, it's really sunset, which would mean that for many people this would be very difficult, right? Surely on a Shabbos like this, during the summer, it's never going to happen, because you're not never, but most of us are going to start Shabbos well before sunset. And therefore, you put it in the fire, you put it in the cholent pot, or you put it in the chicken soup or whatever, 40 minutes, an hour, 2 hours before, it's already started the cooking process at that point, right? So that's the question you're asking. So some poskim therefore say, can't do it. Other poskim say, well then, that can't be, because the Gemara dealt with this as a reality, and clearly some people, not everyone was lighting at the same time, where the Gemara tells us you should be lighting early, and therefore, it has to be subjective. It's going to be subjective to the person who prepares the food. Because the post can point out, sometimes in the same household, right? Sometimes, a man will, if you have a household of a bunch of people, sometimes the kids will accept Shabbos later than the parents. Sometimes a husband will go to shul, accept Shabbos when he says Kabbalah Shabbos, and the wife's still preparing for Shabbos, whatever it is. So Ideally, but strictly speaking, it's not necessary. I wouldn't, it's one of those things. Ideally, but it's, pick your idealies, right? And this is not an area I like to impress upon people because it's a lot of stress getting ready for Shabbos. By me, when I say my wife will subtly remind me, like, let's pick a different chumrah. Go pick a different chumrah. Like, don't do this one because it's hard. People are running around Erev Shabbos. So bottom line is, ideally you should. Don't get me wrong. Ideally you should, but technically everyone could accept Shabbos at a different time within a household. So many poskim say it's the person who is cooking, that's the person who it goes around. So if you are the person, so very often the person cooking is also the person lighting the candles, so it's going to be relevant to you. If you're the one who, so basically what you do is, right before you light candles, you'll throw that raw piece of meat in, and then you'll go light candles. Perfect, because it was only there for a minute. The last thing you do before you light Shabbos candles, you'll take a raw piece of meat, put it in the cholent, and you're good to go. However, okay, good? That answers your question? Okay, fine, good. So, however, let's turn the page. Let's do something in source on source 19 on page 132. This is from Rav Henkin. Okay, and he says like this: Aval lefi daiti, according to me, ein lanu lismoch al heter shel gdera chayta b'tanurim shelanu. He says we cannot rely on this entire leniency with our ovens. Bishul b'tanurim shelanu al gabi apach shona harbe mi bishul shelahem. He says our cooking with our ovens, which have the ability to race up to a high heat or lower heat, we could change the temperature. It takes 5 minutes to go from 0 to 400, whatever, depends on your oven. It takes a few seconds. V'bishul shelahem hayashoa kama shaos b'chol ofen. It took them a long time to cook something. It took them hours. Ulechein lo hechshash. Therefore, there was not a concern. Shem yat min hakadera samach lechashecha yavuli deitikun. If they were to go ahead and place the food on the fire right before Shabbos, they're not going to fix it. Kel kalpanim lo yia mevushal dai achila ad achrei shos achados, because it would take a long time. Aval b'tanurim, about our b'tanureinu in our ovens, yachol levashal afilu b'minutim achadim. You could cook something even in a few minutes. And there is a concern, Shem Yitakin, you might fix it, and you could go ahead and eat it right away. So he says, in our ovens, this whole idea of a raw piece of meat shouldn't apply. It would only apply, he says, in the ancient world, where it took them hours to cook something. So if you put a raw piece of meat, it would take hours to prepare, and therefore you'd say, for tonight I'm not going to worry about it, and therefore the raw piece of meat will allow you to leave something on a fire that was uncovered. So if you were cooking something, you could put a raw piece of meat, and it wasn't cooked before Shabbos, you could put a raw piece of meat, because you could assume, I'm not going to think about it for Friday night, it's not going to be ready for the meal, because it would take hours until it's ready. However, nowadays, with our modern ovens, I can just crank up the heat, and it'll be ready. And therefore he says, this whole leniency does not apply. Okay. However, if you turn the page, if you look on page 133 from the Shabbos Kitchen, wonderful, wonderful book. He says, nowadays this leniency of raw meats cannot generally be relied upon, since the modern cooking methods, almost any type of food can be cooked in a relatively short period. However, this ruling does apply with a crock pot, which cooks slowly. Therefore, it is permissible to put raw meats in a crock pot without any blech, meaning any covering, immediately before Shabbos, provided that one is certain the food will not be ready for the evening meal. Moreover, even with a pot of partially cooked food, it is sufficient to put in one piece of raw meat to exempt the entire pot from requiring a blech. So says Rav Simcha Bunim Cohen, and this is the way that we rule, and that is this idea of the raw piece of... So again, let's take a step back. There's a prohibition against leaving not fully cooked food in your oven, on your stovetop, or in a chillin pot. All those things you're not allowed to leave uncooked raw food, okay, unless it's partially cooked, which we'll get to what machal ben drusai is in a second, what the full measurements are. But otherwise, you can't go ahead, right? You're in a rush. It's a winter Friday, and you come home and you want to start cooking, and it's like an hour before Shabbos, start putting your chillin in an hour before Shabbos. You can't do that. You can't do that on your chillin pot. Unless you start covering your chillin pot. We're going to get into what you're allowed, but you can't put your chillins on the fire an hour before. You can't put your chicken soup up an hour before, okay? Unless your elements are covered in a certain way, which we'll get to. One of the leniencies is placing a raw piece of meat, because if you do so, it demonstrates, it makes it clear you're not going to be eating it for the Friday night meal. That leniency says only applies to a crock pot. a slow cooker, because everything else you could still have it for Friday night. If I put raw chicken in my chicken soup right before Shabbos, okay, it might not be the most tasty, intense chicken soup, but the bottom line is I could put the heat really high, and I'll have an edible chicken soup for Friday nights, even if it's raw chicken or raw meat or whatever. I'll still have it edible. It's not going to be so great, but it'll still be okay, right? But the bottom line is therefore I can't, the only place this leniency applies is going to be for chulent, because for chulent in a slow cooker, by definition, it cooks slowly. That would be more akin to the fire, the ovens they had in the ancient world. But to throw this raw piece of meat in any other cooking elements, it would not work. Yes?
Does that only apply to chulent? Can it apply to other things?
Anything in a slow cooker. I'm sorry. Yes. Anything in a crock pot. Anything in a slow cooker. Okay? Good? Okay, now let's review something we spoke out, but we'll just we'll get into it a little bit more detail, and that is this notion of ma'achal ben drusai. If you recall, what we saw 2 weeks ago was that the idea was that you can't, as I just said a second ago, you can't place uncooked food on the fire unless the Gemara said it's cooked k'ma'achal ben drusai, which, as we'll see in a moment, is a minimal amount of cooking, but what it means is essentially it's edible, because once it's edible, the concern, again, the whole issue is that a person's going to come, Shabbos going to start, and they're like, oh my gosh, my food is not ready, I'm going to start adjusting the flames or stoking the coals. But as long as it's now, basically edible when Shabbos begins, my anxiety level goes down. I'm looking at this through a psychological Ben, but that's what it is. It's basically once it's partially edible, then your concern of I'm going to have no food for the Friday night meal has already gone down significantly, and therefore I'm no longer as concerned that I'm going to go ahead and adjust the flames, and therefore I'm allowed to leave it on the fire even though it's an uncovered fire. So, okay, so we'll talk about practical examples, but what is machal ben drusai? We spoke this out a little bit. Let's just see it inside. Let's see source 21. So first of all, what is this term, machal ben drusai? Ben drusai listim haya umevashel bishulo shlish. Ben drusai was a thief, and he would cook his food a third of the way. Okay, so what does this mean? He was a thief and would cook his food a third of the way. So we explained this the other week, and that is that he was always on the run. He was always on the run, and therefore he would not stay in one place for very long, right? And certainly when you cook a fire, right? If when you cook a fire, you start to get smoke. So it's not if you're someone who's on the run, you want to cook as short as possible and then extinguish the flames immediately. So what's the minimal that Ben Drusai, the guy who is always on the run, what's the minimal he would cook? Says Rashi, a third of the way. A third of the way. Because at a third of the way, then it's already edible. Okay, you and I may not cook our steak, a third of the way. We'd want to cook it a little longer, or chicken, but a third of the way, it's basically edible, and that's the minimal amount that it has to be cooked. Once it's cooked a third of the way, according to Rashi, then we're no longer considering to stoke the coals since it's already edible. Yes.
I wonder what Hussy had to have his name included in.
Yeah. No, agreed. It's really something. I don't know if it's a schus. I think, you find this principle, just a little tangent of mine, but you find this idea by a couple of places. How do we learn the notion of a minyan? The minyan needs 10 men. Where do you learn that from? Anyone know? How do we know 10 men?
10 Commandments.
Not from 10 Commandments, not from Avraham Avinu? No?
No, from when
No. We learn it actually, so there's one place that says that God, holiness appears by an Eidah, the term Eidah, which means adat. You ever hear adat, means a congregation? And then elsewhere, in the story of the spies, Moshe is told, Hibadlu mitocha Eidah hara'ah hazot. Separate yourself from this bad and evil Eidah. Okay? And the Eidah, how many of the spies were bad? 10, right? Because 2 of them were Yeshua and Kalev, so 12 minus 2 is 10. So there are 10 of them, and they're called an Eidah. So you see, 10 men are called an Eidah. We're learning it from Rishaim, from terrible people, right? So I think, I don't know, I think this is a theme that we're constantly learning elements of holiness from some of the quote-unquote worst characters. We actually learn, we learn the notion of a minyan from 10 people who end up getting just dying from this grotesque death. And similarly, Machal ben Drusai, we learn these laws of Shabbos. So I don't know, there's a theme over here, there's some lesson over here. But take whatever lesson you want. But I think there's this idea, sometimes you can learn from, we dismiss certain people, we ignore certain people, we think there's nothing to learn. Some of the greatest lessons in life could be learned from some of the greatest criminals, the worst Rishaim, etc. There's a lot to learn from them, so don't dismiss them so quickly. Okay, fine. Okay, says the Shulchan Aruch. What's the ruling? Is it a third? So says the Shulchan Aruch, source 23. We're going to skip the Rambam. That says the Shulchan Aruch Rav, Shir Machal ben Drusai. The measurement. What is the measurement? Yesh omrim shu kamo shlish bishul hara'u lechal adam. There are those who say it's a third. V'yesh omrim shu kamo chati bishulo, and there are those who say it's half of its cooking. Okay, so which one is it? Okay, so says, right, some say it's a half, Some say it's a third. So what is a half and a third? The simple way of understanding this is the example I gave the other week. And that is, let's say it takes 2 hours to cook chicken. Okay, you have chicken, it takes 2 hours to cook it. Sounds reasonable? 2 hours, right? So one opinion says a half. What does a half mean? It means if it's cooked an hour before Shabbos begins, that's machal ben drusai. That means it's enough partially cooked, and you can leave it in your oven partially cooked. If you hold it's a third, it would be 40 minutes, right? That's what it means, partially cooked, right? So what's the halacha? Which one do we rule? Like a half, a third? So it says the Mishnah Berurah. If you turn to page 135, source 24, the Mishnah Berurah is otherwise known as the Chafetz Chaim. He wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. He writes, K'machal ben drusai, yesh omrim chatzi bishul. There are those who say it's halfway cooked. Yesh omrim shlish bishul. There are those who say it's a third cooked. And the Shulchan Aruch elsewhere says, without qualifying, he says half cooked. And when you're really stuck, you can rely on the more lenient view. Okay, so what does that mean practically? So let's just apply this to a practical case. A person comes home, Erev Shabbos Friday, in the winter, and they just got home and they didn't get around to cooking any of their food. They have chicken. It's going to take 2 hours to make their chicken ready, and they want to put it in their oven. The problem is it's not fully cooked, and it's there's only 40 minutes left to Shabbos, right? So what are you allowed to? Are you allowed to place that chicken in the oven? The answer is yes. If you're really, ideally, an hour would be the ideal amount of time. But if you're really stuck, you'd be allowed to place it in the oven 40 minutes before Shabbos. That's Shas Chak. You're really stuck. You have no food Friday night, or you have just whatever. You want to have your regular Shabbos meal. You'd be allowed to place the chicken in the oven 40 minutes before Shabbos, even though it's just a regular oven. You're not covering it. There's no blech in the oven, whatever. You basically could place your uncooked chicken in the oven, ideally an hour before Shabbos, but even 40 minutes before Shabbos, and that would be okay. Yes?
For some reason, I remember when we don't hold like with ovens and stoves, that we don't hold with maybe I should remember.
So we're going to get into a whole discussion about opening the ovens, taking things out. We're going to get into that. It's going to be an extensive discussion. We're not going to get there today. But the bottom line is, the short answer is that many would say that's totally fine. Okay, so this comes up sometimes. Person stuck, right? You're running before Shabbos. Again, not ideal, but it happens. It happens. And the same way, so one day you could wake up and there's a frozen block of coffee ice in your freezer, in your fridge. So too, one day you might, whatever, some busy Erev Shabbos, you didn't have time to prepare your food. Okay, there's an hour left. What can you do? You can still put it in the oven. You can still put your chicken in the oven, as long as it would be, by the time Shabbos begins, it would be either a halfway or at the very least a third way cooked. That would be sufficient. Okay? Now, there is an interesting discussion in the Piskei Teshuvos. If you look at source 25, he writes like this. Okay, so Piskei Teshuvos is like a more modern day collection of different authorities. He writes, Shir Machal ben Drusai. So the measurement of Machal ben Drusai, Machlokas im Shlish Bishul or Chatzi Bishul, right? So it is a debate whether it's a third of the way cooked or a half of the way cooked. Umesharim bizman habishul, and we measure this by the amount of time it takes to cook. Kegon imisbashal kol tzork v'beishos. For example, the example I just gave, if it takes 2 hours to cook, arbaim dakot heim shlish bishulo. 40 minutes would be 1/3. V'nir shad shizbashel magia. For the first little while until it gets hot, it's not even counted. So he says we have to also account for a few extra minutes, right? Because until it actually gets hot, the cooking process has not yet begun. So really you want to give yourself a little bit more of a buffer, because for the first, X amount of time, if you were to put your food in the oven and then pull it out 5 minutes later, your food's not hot yet. You have to wait first it has to get hot, and then that's when the counting starts. Okay, so if let's say, it's an hour before Shabbos and you have your chicken, you could probably put it in because maybe in 20 minutes it's going to get hot enough, and then you can rely on the third for the 40 minutes.
The food gets hot or the oven gets hot?
The food gets hot. Okay? The beginning of cooking is when the food is very hot. From there are those who disagree. You can't do these calculations of time. He says this whole notion of half, third makes no sense. He says so often when it comes to cooking, it's only at the end that the real cooking takes place. If you get very technical, it could be that the first 40 minutes, it's not really a third, it's a third in time, but not a third in process. Right? In other words, if you follow the process of cooking while it's happening in the oven, or scientifically, you'll see that, yes, the first 40 minutes, maybe it's just getting hotter and hotter. But in terms of the transformation of the food, what we'll call like full-fledged cooking, much of it's going to happen in the latter parts of the cooking. And therefore, if you want to say 40 minutes in, it's not really cooking yet, a third of the cooking. It's a third of the time that it takes to cook something, but it's not a third of the way cooked. Okay, so he says, El Masharnim Raya Lechel Aydei Chak. Rather, the way we assess it is a different type of measurement, and that is this food edible or not? Because what is Machal Ben Drusai at the end of the day? What it is would a person, push come to shove, eat this? If you take a raw piece of meat out of your fridge, you're not taking a bite out of it, right? But if you put a raw piece of food in the oven and you're in a big rush, at what point would we say it's edible? It's not necessarily about time, it's more about measuring how to figure this out. Now, obviously, according to that second opinion, you just made my life very complicated. I don't know how to assess this. I'm usually not in a major rush. I usually cook things properly, right? So what do you do? So the good news is that most poskim rule leniently, and they say we just go with time. It's too complicated. We just go with time. We don't have to worry. Although it's very logical to make this argument that really we should just be making the measurements based on when it's basically edible. We don't have to. It's too complicated. And so basically what we do is we say, how long does it take to cook this item? Whatever the amount is, 2 hours, 4 hours, 3 hours, and then you divide it into thirds or into halves, and then you have your measurement for Machal Ben Drusai. Good? Questions? Thoughts? Okay, so let's now get into some very practical applications of Shehiyah. So again, what we saw until now is that coming into Shabbos, you should not place food that is not fully cooked. Ideally, you shouldn't be placing food that's not fully cooked. However, if it's a third of the way cooked, then, or ideally even a halfway cooked, then you could, okay? But if it's not, let's say it's not. So, for example, let's use the best example for I think many of us. I imagine it's safe to say that most of our, let's say, Friday night foods are already fully cooked when we start Shabbos. Usually, safe assumption. Yeah, hopefully, on an ideal Shabbos. Okay. The one thing that's not fully cooked is our cholent, right? So basically, it's not fully cooked. Okay. So so that's going to be our big example of of something which is not fully cooked. So we said, if I put a raw piece of meat in right before Shabbos, great. Anyone do that over here, by the way? Put a raw piece of meat right before Shabbos sometimes? Okay. Fine. Sorry? You put it up right before Shabbos, you have a raw piece of meat, and that'd be fine. Good. If you start it right before Shabbos, that's fine. Yeah.
How long, what's right considered right before Shabbos? And half an hour before Shabbos is heating up? That's right before?
I'm not, do it right before. Do it right before. The last thing you do before you're lighting candles, then you're for sure safe, because it's going to take a half hour should be fine, because again, until it gets hot, you're for sure okay with a half hour, and a crock pot, certainly you're probably okay with a half hour, but I'm afraid to give exact measurements, but just do it as late as possible and you're good to go. But okay, so we're going to talk about, what the Gemara told us was that this whole principle is, one way of circumventing this whole prohibition is if my fire is covered. Okay, so in the ancient world, what that meant was I had coals in the bottom of my oven. Again, what is my oven? My oven was like a box, and on the bottom of the box was coals. At the top of the box was a hole, and I put my pot at the top of the box. That was the ancient oven. And the Gemara said, if I cover my coals with ashes, then it's not a problem. Why? So there was almost two interpretations that came out of it. One is, once I cover it with ashes, it starts to minimize the level of heat. The other is, covering with ashes reminds me, if I come out, I was like, oh no, my food's not ready, I'm not going to stoke it. Say, oh right, I put ashes there. Why did I put ashes there? Because it's Shabbos. Okay, fine, I won't stoke it. Right? So placing a cover both serves to minimize the heat a little bit, and it also serves as a reminder. So the question is, you and I, most of us don't cook with coals, typically, right? Maybe a barbecue, but we're not cooking with coals. So how does this apply to our modern day ovens? What do we have to cover? And what is considered a legitimate covering? What's a cover? Right? Ashes, we can understand. Ashes is a good cover because it's counter to what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to heat something up. Ashes extinguishes, right? So how do you apply that nowadays? To what is considered a cover that is similar enough to ashes that it no longer is seen as that it's really full-fledged cover, again, identical to that of ashes. That's what we're going to be grappling with today. Today we're going to be focusing on a blech. Okay, so what is a blech? When I use the word blech, what I mean is just that piece of metal, right? I'm not talking about the electric hot plate. I'm talking about just the piece of metal that people use to cover their stovetop. Is that good? Does that work? What type of blech? We're going to get into that. Okay, so says the Shulchan Aruch. If you look on page 137, says the Shulchan Aruch, Hamashkim b'boker. So he gives a particular case, but fine. He gives a particular case. This person wakes up in the morning. V'rasha kedecha tavshilu v'yaripen gakdech yoser. He sees that the food is burning, and they're afraid it's going to burn more. Okay, sometimes you wake up and you see your food's on the fire, it's burning. So what could you do? What you could do is you could take an empty pot and place it on the fire. So you flip over pot number 1, empty pot, and then you place pot number 2 on top of it. The Shulchan Aruch over here, forget the case of burning. The bottom line is the Shulchan Aruch saying that is the same as covering a fire. Well, we can understand that. Why? Because in that case, putting an empty pot like that, there's a big air gap now of space between what you're cooking on and not. And that's like a full-fledged cover, right? That's a full-fledged cover in the sense that like that's not like clearly that's not meant to be there to help you with the cooking. On the contrary, it's meant to like delimit the covering because it's creating extra air between the fire and the food. So turning over a pot is clearly a good cover for your fire. Yeah.
He's assuming that it's on an open flame?
He's assuming that he's talking about very briefly. He's talking about a case where we went into Shabbos with a full-fledged something which is fully cooked, no problem.
And it's on an open flame?
It's on an open flame, it's just fully cooked. There'd be no issue, right? Meaning the same way you could put if your children was fully cooked before Shabbos or even halfway cooked before Shabbos, you could leave it on an open flame. The issue over here is on Shabbos you want to be putting it back. And so it's a little bit of a complicated case, but the bottom line is what comes out of the Shulchan Aruch is turning over a pot. So let's say you had on your stovetop, you had an element that was on, okay, and you wanted to put up a chicken soup right before Shabbos begins, okay, or an hour before Shabbos begins. It takes your chicken soup 3 hours to cook, 4 hours to cook, okay, so it's not even going to be a third of the way cooked. So what you could do, according to this, is take a pot, turn it over on top of your elements, and then put a pot on top of that, no problem. I wouldn't recommend it if you have little kids around because someone's going to knock the thing over and chas v'chalila, it's going to be bad. But the point is that that's a good cover. And no one would disagree because that, like, clearly that's like a very abnormal thing to do. It's certainly going to remind you if you see it, I'm not going to mess with this metal, this oven because it's going to, and also it's creating a diminishment of heat because I'm adding like a whole airspace between it. Right? No one would ever otherwise do this unless you're trying to remind yourself not to cook on Shabbos. So again, if you want to take the Shulchan Aruch at face value and you wanted to cook something a little bit before Shabbos and you wanted a chicken soup for Shabbos day, okay, you're weird. Just kidding. It's called. You're fine. You're smart. You do your own thing. You want to have chicken soup Shabbos day? That's great. I would love to have chicken soup Shabbos day. Sorry, I apologize for anyone who does that. Okay, that was a joke. But the point is that you want to have chicken soup for Shabbos day. Totally cool, totally fine, totally great. It's winter and you're gonna be cold. You come back from shul. You want to have chicken soup. So what do? And you don't have time to prepare before Shabbos. No problem. Flip over a pot or put a pot on the oven. Put the cover on it and then put another pot on top of it. No problem. Doesn't matter how cooked it is. It could be raw. It could be partially raw. Totally fine because that oven is covered. It's covered in a very substantial way. Yes.
Shulchan Aruch is talking about doing this on Shabbos.
So yeah.
I can understand all the things, doing it right before Shabbos, that all makes sense.
Because he's talking about, so it's a little bit confusing because he's talking about another halacha called chazara, which is returning, and the principles of chazar and shehiyah are the same, and that's why he's drawing from that case. So he happens to not mention this in the context of shehiyah, but it's the same principle for chazara. I chose not to get into it, but I think that was a mistake because I think I confused more people than not. So thank you for bringing that up. He's talking about a particular case, which is not our case, but it's based on the same principles of when are you allowed to place something on a fire? And the answer is when it's fully covered, when it's covered in a good way, having a pot on top of your elements, and then putting a your pot of soup on top of that, you're good to go. All right? So if you come home before Shabbos, you want to make us chicken soup, and it's not enough time to be a third of the way cooked, no problem. Turn over a pot or put a pot on top of your fire. It might get burnt. It'll probably get black by the end of Shabbos. Put a pot, empty pot there, and then put another pot on top of it. You're good to go. Okay, that doesn't still tell us what about a blech. A blech, you can understand, is not identical to that, right? So says Moshe Feinstein, says on page 138, source 28, he says, Vim kain begaz, with a gas flame. He says, no one in their right mind would ever cook with a sheet of metal on top of their thing. In other words, if you had to cook some, I told you, go home and go cook some eggs, or go home and go make a vegetable soup. Would you ever place a piece of metal on top of your elements for fun? Of course not. Right? No way. You just put it directly on the element. In the bold words, he says there's no greater reminder than our classic metal blech. You would never otherwise cover with this piece of metal unless you were trying to remind yourself of something. And therefore Moshe Feinstein says, granted the heat, it could generate a very similar amount of heat as placing it directly on the element, because it's going to take only a few minutes till a piece of metal is blistering hot. But nonetheless, he says, if we're talking about reminders, it's a perfect reminder. Okay? He said, then skips the next paragraph, and the next bold words, Ulefiza apelo kisoy gam ala kaftorim. So even if you don't cover the the knobs, or he defines the buttons, through which you elevate or lower the heat. You only cover the fire. Nami efshar le'esh lahater. That should still be sufficient. Degam bekisa le'esh levad hu heker gadol. Because even just placing a blech over the fire, that's a great reminder. Shein daito lachtos ulahagdil le'esh yoser, and demonstrating that you're not planning on adjusting the heat. Ukamosha nogan harbe, as many people have the custom. So he's acknowledging over here that there'd be an argument to be made. Again, in the ancient world, let's review. The source of heat was also the place that you were going to adjust the flames. The source of heat were the coals. The coals are the source of heat. By covering them, you're doing two things. One, you're covering the actual fire, but two, it's the place where you stoke the coals. So you're also covering our modern day knobs, right? Their coals could be divided in our ovens to two things. Their coals are both the source of heat, but also their knobs, because that's where you adjust the temperature. So Moshe is saying over here, when it comes to our blech, do I also have to cover the knobs? He says, nah, since I have this covering of the gas, that's enough of a reminder. He says, you don't have to. Then he says, if you look on the page 139, he says, I'm just going to read the bold words, Ach yoser tov. It's better, ideally, your metal should also cover the buttons. It should really, ideally, be in the same place that you would stoke it, and therefore you should cover the knobs. And next, just jumps to the next paragraph, the underlines, therefore you should be strict to cover the knobs. Since even without covering the knobs is a recognizable, significant visual cue, as they translate it, you could rely on this if you have to. You don't have to protest against those who cover only the fire. Okay, so you may have noticed that there are two types of these metal blechs. There's the classic one, which is just a sheet of metal, which many of us have or grew up with. And then there's the more sophisticated one, which is a sheet of metal, and then it goes down on the bottom. And the purpose of going down is to cover the knobs that are under the piece. Why is that? Makes a lot of sense. That's Rav Moshe basically saying, ideally, you should cover both, because there's two things. One is the reminder over the heat element. The other is the reminder covering the buttons. He says, strictly speaking, he said, we certainly can rely on just covering the heat element. That's enough of a reminder. But he says, ideally, you should have something that covers both. Is there a question? No, we're here. Okay. Yes.
So I don't even know if they still make them, but years ago, there were blechs that you filled with water. Does that have anything?
We're going to get into that. We're going to get into that.
It's a different principle.
It's a similar principle. It's a similar principle. And some would argue, it's a similar principle. Okay. It's exactly. It's supposed to be a pot. Okay. It's more. It's in some ways more ideal than this plain piece of metal, because if you turn the page, source 30 on the page for the Chazon Ish says. Okay, he's referring to blechs in general. He says, and we'll just read the bold words. He says, "Mikol makom." Nonetheless, lo chashiv. He's referring to a blech. It's lo chashiv kedin nasan kederi kanis alakera alakir lahafsik. He says placing a blech is not similar to placing an empty pot to make this separation. Tahacha lo have rake kisa sakira bikisuya. Placing a piece of metal is like placing a cover on top of it. It's not like a full-fledged empty pot. This is no different than placing a pot on a fire. And this is the normative ruling in Israel. They're much more stringent about blechs. And they would say that if you just place a piece of metal, many, not just everyone in Israel, but many in Israel agree with this argument of the Chazon Ish, and there's a good argument to be made. At the end of the day, granted, it looks funny, as Rav Moshe is saying. But at the end of the day, from a cooking perspective, if I were to tell you from now on, leave a blech on top of your fire, would it make a difference to your life? Not really. It doesn't look so pretty, right? It gets all brown and black or whatever, but like, I don't know, it doesn't make a difference, right? Does it really make a difference? Minuscule, not even, right? It makes no difference at all, right? So the Chazon Ish is saying, what does it help over here? All I did was place something. From a cooking perspective, this blech is exactly the same. From a cooking perspective, it's exactly the same heat, and therefore a blech does not work. And therefore the Chazon Ish rejects this idea of a blech, and many in Israel do not put any uncooked food items on this classic piece of metal. Let's say it's not enough. Rav Moshe argues, says the minhag is to be more lenient. Says certainly if you're covering both the knobs and the fire, it's okay. But Chazon Ish has a good argument saying it's not the same. The Shulchan Aruch was talking about placing an empty pot and then placing a pot on top of that. That's bizarre. That's not the way to cook. No, if I tell you have to cook for the rest of your life with an empty pot and then a pot on top of it, then you get a little nervous. But if I just say put a piece of metal, no big deal. Yes.
Is it possible that one is emphasizing the cooking aspect and the other one's emphasizing the hecker, like the recognition aspect? Like, because there's two different opinions as to what the blech is.
It could be, the Chazon Ish seems to be disagreeing with both. He seems to be saying at the end of the day, like, since it could cook regularly, what kind of reminder is this as well? Meaning it's both, right? It seems to be. Okay?
Is that just for cooking or it's also for chazar?
It's going to be for both. We haven't gone to Chazar, but it's going to be for both. Yeah. Okay. So let's see. There are different opinions. If you look at source 33, it's from the book Hilchos Shabbos, and page 141. He says, "Shamati b'shem Moreno Rav Rav Aaron Cutler." Okay, this is the person who established the Lakewood Yeshiva. De betanurim didan in our ovens. Af de tov shegama eish yemechusa beblech. Even though it's ideal that the fire should be covered with a blech, meaning the elements. Ha'ikar hu bekisu af katarim. He holds, not like Moshe, he holds the main thing is actually covering the buttons. Uv'diyeved, and therefore, if we're stuck, obemakom shekash lechasos ha'esh, kigon be'ezeh tanurei chashmal, some electric ovens where it's hard to cover the fire. So think about maybe an oven, a glass stovetop, right, where it's covering the elements, could actually get quite dangerous, right? To go ahead and cover the elements, you could cause a fire, you cause the thing to break, cause a fire. There, bekisoy kaftarm levad mahani, there in those types of cases, covering the knobs alone is effective. So we don't typically rule like this more well, I'm call it lenient, but Ramosha says the main thing is covering the elements. Why? Because that's where the fire comes out. Rav Aaron Cutler says the main thing is covering the buttons. Why? Because that's where you adjust the flames. Now, most do not agree with Rav Aaron Cutler unless you're stuck. If it's a situation where you can't cover the elements, there's what's rely upon to just cover the knobs, and we'll see other modern applications where that would be the right thing to do. But it's brought down in page on source 34. He says certainly you have to cover the elements with a blech. And it is forbidden to leave something which is not fully cooked on a fire without the blech. There is no recognition. And to leave it in a regular way without covering the elements, that would be forbidden. He says, in addition, you have to cover the buttons or the knobs, or to remove them if possible. By mistake, you won't move it. To make the changes, even though you already covered the element. Meaning you have to do both. Okay, so you have one opinion saying, like Ramosha says, just cover the elements. Ideally cover the other one, but main thing is covering the elements. You have Rav Aaron Cutler says you just cover the buttons, okay, which is certainly a minority view. And then there are many who say you really need to cover both. Okay, so let's apply this to our modern day crock pot. Okay, because your crock pot's going to be the thing where you the most going to. So, or your stovetop, again, stovetops, that would mean ideally if you could get it, if you want to use a blech to put uncooked food on your fire before Shabbos on a stovetop, what you'd want to do is put a blech, and ideally you want to get a blech that covers your knobs as well. Okay, or tape your knobs or take your knobs off, ideally. If again, that's only for putting uncooked food. If your food that you're putting on your blech is cooked, there's no problem. Right? Let's talk about your crock pot with something which is uncooked, a cholent or a soup or whatever it is that's not fully cooked, and it's not even halfway cooked, right? I mean, it's not machal ben drusai. So there, what you want to do, if you want to put cholent up on the fire in your crock pot before Shabbos, and it either is not right before Shabbos, so it's not completely raw, and it's not well before Shabbos, so it's a third of the way cooked. So what's the way to cover your crock pot? The way to do so is to either take off the knob and tape the knob ideally, and to put some form of a blech in the crock pot. What does a blech look like? A blech, according to many, would simply be a piece of foil covering the elements. So it gets a little messy, but basically not terrible. You can do it slowly and do it nicely. But basically what you want to do in your crock pot, will take you 5 minutes today to do, is take pieces of foil, like you basically take like I take like a long piece of foil each direction, and then I drop the thing in while the foil is still like loose. I drop the insert in, and then I like kind of cut around it, and then you have yourself a nice little insert. It lasts for a little while till it starts tearing. Take like thick foil, and then by doing so, you're covering the elements with the equivalent of a blech. It's not a hard blech; it's a soft blech. You can't put a hard blech in your crock pot. So basically, just put foil covering it. That's a hecker. That's a reminder, and you tape the button, and then you're good according to all opinions. So just in case, right? Even if you tell me you're a yaki and you always, no matter what, you always put up your cholent right before Shabbos, or you always go ahead and put it up a third of the way cooked before Shabbos, sometimes things are going to happen. And on that Shabbos, when something happens, you're not going to have the time to go ahead and put all this stuff down. So it can't hurt to go ahead now and put out a blech, foil out on covering the elements, covering the entire elements, and the elements in a crock pot usually are on the bottom and on the sides. Typically, they have coils around the side, covering all the elements, as well as a piece of tape on the button. You're good to go. Yes.
So I just realized, like, if I leave the foil, because I only use a crock pot for Shabbos, if I leave the foil
Yeah, it's a good question. Some say, hey, is that really a hecker? I'm always doing it. Most poskim say it's fine.
After I print it,
Yeah, most poskim say it's fine because it looks bizarre. It looks weird, even though it's something you're used to doing. Yes.
So if you always put your shalment up early enough that it's not, and it is a problem, then you don't need to.
You don't need to do this. I'm just suggesting practical advice. Always has an exception. So maybe not. Okay, Mitz Hashem, you should have all your Fridays should be good like that. Halavai, we should all be zocha. But yes, in theory, that's all you need. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I use the one I told you.
It's like a plate.
It's a plate, and then
Yeah.
you put the thing on top.
Yeah.
The actual bottom, because that's where the elements are, even though it's like gets hot, tape won't stick to the buttons.
On the button. So again, so you paste a piece of foil. It's not to stick. Meaning, if this is your device, okay, my safer is your device. You put it on, and the buttons are here. So take a piece of foil over here, covering the elements, and let it cover this. Doesn't have to be taped down. Cover. Doesn't have to be taped down.
It's not enough to just turn it around. So you're not.
Most poskim don't like that. It's not brought down like classic poskim. Just turn it around. Okay. Have a great day. We'll pick up next week.